Today we are back at California Auto Workz and we are dyno testing my dad's 1970 Dodge Challenger RT, which is actually an original RT and it's not an RT clone like a lot of other cars out there. This car has been a work in progress for the last 4 years, and finally now in 2024 we've finally got this car ready to go and up on the dyno. We actually took this car out to the track last year for Power Tour West, where it raced against my 1973 Dodge Charger sporting a 361 cubic inch turbocharged big block Mopar. We had a pretty close race up until about the 660 where his car actually started to stumble and backfire. It looked like he was running into some fueling issues, so we figured it was time to throw this car on the dyno and actually get the tune all sorted out. Alright, we've got our first baseline runs in. Before we get started, I want you guys to guess how much horsepower this engine made on its baseline run. A little background information on this motor. This is a 440 cubic inch big block Mopar, naturally aspirated, 750 mechanical secondary Proform carburetor that is sitting on top of an aluminum dual plane intake, 100% factory valve train except for the camshaft. The bottom end is 100% stock, and the only other upgrade on this motor is 1 7/8" long tube headers, running out to a dual exhaust chambered mufflers with an xpipe. From the factory, this engine produced 375 horsepower at the flywheel that was with no accessories on an engine dyno. Right now, the engine has full accessories minus the air cleaner, running through a 727 automatic transmission, a Mopar 8 3/4 rear axle, 223 rear gears, and 275 65 15 street tires. Okay, so moment of truth. If you guys guess 245 horsepower and 294 pound-feet of torque, you are the winner. But there's a little bit more to the story. And maybe by the end of this dyno session, your guess might still be correct. If you guys look at the graph here, you can see that we start off at around 12.5 to 1 on the air-fuel ratio. You can see that it quickly leans out after the initial hit, and then it just keeps getting leaner and leaner as the RPM climbs. By the end of the run, we're closer to 15 to 1, which is definitely in the danger zone. There's a red dotted line here on the screen which tells us where the danger zone is at, so anything above that is in the danger zone. So the first thing to do was to actually add a bunch of jet in the rear and then rerun the engine again. After adding about 6 jets in the rear, we went ahead and ran the dyno again. This time the engine made 254 horsepower, but torque stayed about the same at 290 pound-feet of torque. However, we were able to continue that curve out further, about 1,000 RPM, which is really, really good. And the numbers don't really tell the whole story. If you guys see right here in the mid-range, the engine actually picked up power from about 3,900 all the way out to redline. I added another set of numbers here on the screen, and we are looking at average power. So the average power on the first run was about 210 horsepower. Average power on the second run was 212, which means that on average throughout the entire curve it picked up 2 horsepower, which is always good. Average torque jumped up from 235 on average to 240. So even though the max torque number actually dropped, the average torque number actually went up. So we know that we're definitely heading in the right direction. If you look at the air fuel chart, you can see that we did track a little bit richer all the way across, but not rich enough. So the next thing we're going to go ahead and try is we're going to drill out the power valve restrictor channels so we can balance out the front and the rear and see if we can get that air fuel ratio to balance itself out a little bit better. So now that we went ahead and tweaked the power valve restrictor channels, this is going to go ahead and confuse a lot of people because it looks like we actually lost power throughout the entire curve. In fact, if we look at average power, we actually dropped 5 horsepower. And if we look at the average torque, we actually dropped 15. So there's not really a good reason why we lost power, except for the fact that we realized that the distributor somehow got moved because we did mark it before we started our dyno runs, and somehow we must have messed up the timing. Timing was not really going to change our air fuel ratio, and we saw that there's a lean spot spike here in the beginning. So what we decided to do is we decided to add more jet down here at the bottom in the primary side. And as you guys know, whatever you add to the bottom gets added across the top. So we went ahead and we added 3 jets to the primary side, and then we ran it on the dyno again. So comparing our run where the timing was where it was supposed to be to our latest run with more fuel, we went up to 266 horsepower. Power peak came in at 5200 RPM. Average power jumped up from 212 horsepower to 234 horsepower, which is 20 horsepower on average. Maximum torque jumped up from 290 to 304. The torque peak didn't necessarily move. It still stayed around 4100 RPM. But the average torque actually jumped up from 240 to 273, which is 33 pound-feet of torque on average. If you guys look at our AFR charts, you guys are going to see that we are in the safe range, and now we can go ahead and start adding timing. Up till now, we went ahead and ran everything on 28 degrees. We're going to go ahead and step up timing from the 28 degrees that we verified up to now 30 degrees. Now that we've made our timing adjustments, this is what we came up with. Power went up again from 266 to 271 horsepower. It looked like the peak power came in sooner from 5200 to 5000. Average power jumped up from 243 to 240, which is some pretty good gains right there. Our torque values are 304 up to 311. Our torque peak came in sooner at about 3900 RPM. But it looked like our average torque actually dropped down a little bit from 273 to 268. And if we go ahead and look at the chart, we can see that down here around 3,500 RPM, we're actually making less torque. But anything after 3,500, we're making more torque. So we're not going to be worrying about that too much. If we look at our air-fuel ratio, everything is still right around where we were before. So we're going to go ahead and add another 2 degrees of timing. Now that we added 2 degrees of timing, we are at a total of 32 degrees. It looks like power jumped up a little bit more from 271 to 275 horsepower. The power peak didn't really move. It stayed around 5,000 RPM. Average power seemed to drop from 240 to 230 horsepower. Maximum torque came up from 318 up from the 311 on the last run. What's interesting is the torque peak actually came in a lot sooner at 3,200 RPM. But again, actually our average torque went down from 268 to 260 on average. And if we're looking at the charts, the only time the engine is making more power is below 3,600 RPM, and everywhere above that, we're making the same power or less than when we had the engine at 32 degrees. Our air-fuel ratio actually got richer, which tells us that the engine actually became less efficient. And all of this combined tells us that we already went too far on the timing curve. And we're going to go ahead and backtrack back to 30 degrees of total timing instead of the 32. Comparing our baseline to our final numbers, this is what we have. Our baseline was 245 horsepower at 5,000 RPM. That went up to 271 horsepower at 5,000 RPM. Average power jumped up from 210 to 240 horsepower. Maximum torque started off at 294, 311. The torque peak started at 3,100 RPM, and later it found its maximum torque at 3,900 RPM. Our average torque values started off at 235, and our average torque ended at 268. Looking at our air-fuel charts, we can see a vast improvement all the way to the end. It does look like the engine could use a little bit more fuel on the top end, but at this point, we're just splitting hairs. Overall, I do think this dyno session was a success. What do you guys think? Let me know in the comments down below. I will see you guys all in the next one. Night Wrencher, signing out.